August 1953. The streets of Tehran are filling up with people. Shops are being smashed. Men are shouting things they do not fully understand. Army trucks are moving through intersections that were clear an hour ago. Radio stations are broadcasting contradictory announcements, and nobody knows which voice to believe. And in a basement office somewhere in this city, a man is counting out bundles of American dollars and handing them to people who will spend the next 72 hours burning a country's democracy to the ground. 3 days, that is all it took. 3 days to destroy something that had taken a nation decades to build. The operation had a code name, Ajax. The CIA's own internal history, written in secret in 1954 and locked away for 60 years, described what happened in one sentence. A CIA-orchestrated coup. No ambiguity, no diplomatic softening. Their words, in their file, about their operation. What happened in Iran in August 1953 is the answer to a question most people in the West have never thought to ask. Not why does Iran hate America, but what did America do to Iran first, and why, and who paid for it? This is Operation Ajax. Before you can understand what was destroyed in 1953, you need to see what Iran looked like before it. The oil fields of Abadan in southwestern Iran were, by the 1940s, among the most productive in the world. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British corporation, had been extracting oil from Iranian soil for decades. The wealth it generated was extraordinary, and almost none of it stayed in Iran. Iranian workers in those fields lived in corrugated iron shelters without running water. Their children went to schools, if they went at all, that had no books. The pay was barely enough to survive on. A few kilometers from where these men worked themselves into the ground in temperatures that regularly exceeded 50 degrees Celsius, British managers lived in company housing with gardens, swimming pools, and private clubs where Iranians were not permitted to enter, not as guests, not as staff, not at all. The company's own financial records showed something that should have ended the arrangement long before it did. Anglo-Iranian paid more money in taxes to the British government each year than it paid in total to the entire country of Iran, the country whose ground the oil came from, whose workers extracted it, whose sovereignty it sat under. Mohammad Mosaddegh had been watching this for years. He was 70 years old, Swiss-educated, aristocratic by background, a man who sometimes broke into tears during speeches in parliament and who preferred to hold political meetings from his bed while wearing pajamas. He looked like nobody's idea of a revolutionary. He had the energy of one. In April 1951, Mosaddegh stood in the Iranian parliament and proposed the nationalization of the oil industry. Iranian oil, he argued, belonged to Iran. The company that had been taking it for decades would be compensated, but the resource itself, the thing sitting under Iranian soil, extracted by Iranian hands, would from this point forward be Iranian. The parliament voted unanimously, every single member. In the streets of Tehran and across the country, Iranians celebrated in a way that had not been seen in a generation. For one brief, extraordinary moment, it felt like a country had reclaimed something that had always belonged to it. In London, the response was fury. In Washington, they started making calls. Britain's first move was economic. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company organized a global boycott of Iranian oil, pressuring every country, every shipping company, every refinery in the world not to buy from Iran. Iranian tankers sat in the Persian Gulf, full, going nowhere. The oil that Mosaddegh had nationalized could not be sold. The blockade worked exactly as intended. Iran's economy began to buckle. The revenue that was supposed to fund schools and hospitals and the transformation of Iranian society was not coming in. Mossadegh's government was not failing because of its policies. It was being strangled. Britain wanted to go further. They wanted Mosaddegh removed by force. But they had a problem. Mosaddegh had expelled the British from Iran, closing their embassy after relations collapsed. MI6 had no network left inside the country to operate through. They went to Washington, and they brought an argument carefully designed for the moment they were in. Mosaddegh, they told the Americans, was weak. His weakness was creating a vacuum. The Iranian Communist Party, the Tudeh, was filling that vacuum. If Mosaddegh fell to communists, the Soviet Union would have access to Iranian oil and a path to the Persian Gulf. The CIA's own analysts, looking at the same situation, reached a different conclusion. Their internal reports stated clearly that a communist takeover of Iran was not imminent, that Mosaddegh was not aligned with Moscow, that the Tudeh did not have the strength to seize power. The threat Britain was describing, The intelligence community had assessed it and found it was not real. Washington went ahead anyway, because the real concern had never been communism, it had been oil, British oil, and now, potentially, American oil, because any new arrangement after a coup would include American companies in a way the old Anglo-Iranian deal had not. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. arrived in Iran the way spies are supposed to arrive, quietly and without a record of having arrived at all. He crossed the border from Iraq in the back seat of a car, hidden under a blanket, in the middle of the night. He was 37 years old, Harvard-educated, the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. He spoke Farsi. He had been to Iran before, and he had, in a briefcase beside him, more cash than most Iranians would see in a lifetime. Once in Tehran, Roosevelt moved locations every night, safe houses, private villas, the homes of trusted contacts. He never stayed anywhere long enough to be tracked. He was running an operation he could not officially acknowledge, in a country whose government he was about to overthrow, on behalf of an agency that would deny his existence if anything went wrong. The operation he ran over the following weeks touched almost every layer of Iranian society simultaneously. Newspaper editors across Tehran received visits. The conversations were not threatening, they were financial. Editors who published stories critical of Mosaddegh found that their financial difficulties became somewhat less pressing. Those who were not cooperative found other difficulties emerging. Within weeks, without any single dramatic moment, through the accumulation of small transactions, the narrative around Mosaddegh had shifted. Religious leaders, figures whose words carried weight in mosques and communities across the country, received similar approaches. Money, in some cases, fabricated evidence of Mossadegh's hostility to Islam in others, letters he had never written, statements he had never made. Some of the most respected clerics in Iran were being shown documents manufactured in a CIA office. Street gangs, the kind of organized criminal networks that exist in every city and that can mobilize large numbers of men on short notice, were hired directly. The CIA's own declassified account names them. Tehran's most feared figures, paid to organize violence and make it look like political chaos. Mobs that would claim to be Mossadegh supporters while breaking windows and attacking bystanders. Other mobs, hired the same day by the same operation, who would then attack those mobs in the name of order and stability. The people in those crowds, most of them had no idea. They thought they were part of something real, a genuine political movement, history being made by Iranians for Iran. Some of them were, but the ones who had been paid, who had been organized, who were following instructions from handlers they may not have known were working for a foreign government. They were props in someone else's theater. The CIA's own internal document describes the goal plainly. Make Mossadegh's fall look like it came from within Iran, not from outside. A country destroying itself, when in reality a foreign intelligence service was pulling every string. The plan for the night of August 15th was precise. The Shah, who had agreed to cooperate after weeks of pressure, though his hands were reportedly shaking when he signed the documents, had prepared royal decrees. One, dismissing Mosaddegh as prime minister. One, appointing General Fazlollah Zahedi in his place, a man who, for context, had been imprisoned by the British during World War II for collaborating with the Nazis. This was the person chosen to lead Iran after democracy was removed. The colonel assigned to deliver the dismissal decree to Mossadegh's residence drove through the dark streets of Tehran at midnight. He reached the gate opened, and he was arrested. Mosaddegh had been warned. Nobody knows with certainty how. Possibly a leak inside the military, possibly signals intelligence, possibly simple vigilance from a man who knew he had powerful enemies, but he knew. And by the time the colonel arrived at his door, pro-Mossadeghh military units had already mobilized across the city. The conspirators were being rounded up, one by one. General Zahedi had gone into hiding. The Shah panicked. He had never been a man of great courage. Even his supporters acknowledged this. Faced with what looked like the complete collapse of the operation, he fled. A car to the airport, a flight to Baghdad, then another flight, further away, to Rome. The Shah of Iran ended up in a hotel room in Italy, reading foreign newspapers, surrounded by aides who had no answers, trying to understand if he would ever go home. He genuinely believed it was over, that he would die in exile, that everything his father had built would dissolve into something he could not control. CIA headquarters in Washington received the field report. The assessment was clear. The operation had failed. The conspirators were exposed. Continuing was not viable. They sent a message to Kermit Roosevelt in Tehran. Operation canceled. Stand down. Roosevelt read the message. He set it aside, and he picked up the phone. What Kermit Roosevelt did over the next 48 hours, without authorization, against the explicit instructions of his own headquarters, was rebuild the entire operation from the ground up. More money went out. The street networks were reactivated. Military officers who had been contacted before and had wavered were called again with larger sums and clearer promises about what the new government would look like and who would benefit. The Shah in Rome was reached by phone and persuaded to sign new decrees, which were then physically flown from Rome to Tehran and distributed to the relevant commanders. On the morning of August 19th, Tehran woke up to what felt like spontaneous chaos. Crowds were gathering in the southern districts, the poorer areas, the bazaar districts, places where economic frustration was real and where the manufactured crisis of recent weeks had done its work. Pro-Shah religious figures whose support had been quietly cultivated were speaking in mosques. Army units whose commanders had received their instructions the night before were moving into positions. Radio Tehran was seized. Government buildings were surrounded. Mossadegh's residence came under fire. There were genuine Iranians in those crowds who believed in what they were doing, who supported the Shah, who had real reasons, real grievances, real political convictions. This was not purely manufactured. Real politics never is. But the timing, the organization, the funding, the coordination with military units, the careful preparation of the preceding weeks, that had come from a basement office and a man with a briefcase full of American dollars who had ignored a cable telling him to go home. By nightfall on August 19th, it was over. Mosaddegh surrendered at dawn the following day. He walked out of his residence, which had been shelled overnight, with the dignity of a man who understood exactly what had happened to him and refused to pretend otherwise. He was arrested, tried for treason against a Shah whose reinstatement had been engineered by a foreign government, sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by house arrest for the rest of his life. He died in 1967 at 84 years old in the village of Abadan outside Tehran, tending his garden, never free again. 300 people died in the streets of Tehran on August 19th. The Shah flew back from Rome. General Zahedi, the Nazi collaborator, became prime minister. A new oil arrangement was negotiated. American companies received a 40% share. The nationalization that the Iranian parliament had voted for unanimously was effectively dismantled. The oil that Mosaddegh had said belonged to Iran went back to foreign control. Tehran changed after the coup, not dramatically, not overnight, but in the way that cities change when the political atmosphere shifts. The newspapers that had been critical of the government became cautious. The political parties that had organized under Mosaddegh found their meetings disrupted, their members monitored. The university students who had marched in celebration of nationalization found that certain conversations were now better held quietly, in private, with people you trusted absolutely. Savak, the Iranian secret intelligence service created in 1957 with direct CIA and Israeli Mossad assistance, became the instrument of this new atmosphere. Its methods were not subtle. Amnesty International documented them. Human rights organizations documented them. Anyone who spent time in Iran in the 1960s and 1970s and paid attention documented them. Torture, disappearance, political imprisonment for offenses that had no legal definition, the kind of systematic suppression that requires institutional structure, training, and sustained outside support to maintain. The Shah himself, the frightened man who had fled to Rome and returned only because a CIA officer ignored a stand-down order, was not the brutal architect of this system. He was its beneficiary and its enabler. He understood that American support was conditional on stability, and stability, in the context of a country where democracy had just been removed by force, required suppression. He became dependent in ways that a truly sovereign leader cannot afford to be. American advisors in his government, American weapons in his military, American approval as the invisible measure against which every major decision was weighed. The Iranian people watched all of this. The generation that had celebrated in the streets in 1951 grew older and passed what they remembered to their children. The resentment did not fade with time. It accumulated. It combined with new grievances, Savak's cells, the corruption of a court growing visibly wealthy while others struggled, the sense of a country whose destiny was being managed from outside. In 1979, everything that had been accumulating since August 1953 came to the surface at once. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was many things simultaneously: a religious movement, a nationalist uprising, an explosion of decades of suppressed political energy. But underneath all of it, underneath the theology and the ideology and the rhetoric, was something simpler and more durable: rage. Specific, historical, documented rage at what had been done to Iran by outside powers, and by the Iranian governments that had collaborated with those powers. When Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran on November 4, 1979, they did not choose that building randomly. The American embassy was, in Iranian political consciousness, the place where the 1953 coup had been planned. Whether or not that was precisely accurate in operational terms, the CIA had operated out of the embassy. The connection was real. The belief was not irrational. It was historical memory, expressed as action. 66 Americans were taken hostage and held for 444 days. The crisis ended the presidency of Jimmy Carter, who had authorized a rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw, that failed catastrophically in an Iranian desert. It reshaped American domestic politics. It entrenched Iranian revolutionary governance. It established the framework of hostility between the two countries that has never been resolved. In 2013, 60 years after the coup, the CIA released the documents, the internal history, the planning memos, the budget approvals, the field reports from Roosevelt in Tehran. The document that used the word coup without qualification and described what had happened without the diplomatic softening that 60 years of official denial had required. Iran's foreign minister, on the anniversary of the coup in 2018, tweeted the summary that the documents supported. 65 years ago, the United States overthrew Iran's elected government, restored dictatorship, and subjugated Iranians for 25 years. The CIA's own files confirmed the essential accuracy of every word. Mosaddegh died under house arrest in 1967. He never saw his country free again. The Shah died in exile in 1980 in a Cairo hospital of cancer. He never returned to Iran. Kermit Roosevelt died in 2000 in Washington. He wrote a book about the coup that portrayed himself as a hero. He received a medal from the CIA. He expressed no regrets. But August 1953 did not die with any of them. It is alive in every sanction that has been imposed on Iran since 1979. It is alive in every nuclear negotiation that has collapsed under the weight of mutual distrust. It is alive in every confrontation in the Persian Gulf, every proxy conflict, every moment in which two countries face each other across a divide that has its roots not in religion, not in ideology, but in a decision made by men with briefcases full of cash in a basement office in Tehran in the summer of 1953. The CIA analysts who assessed the situation at the time said the communist threat was not real. They were right. Mosaddegh was not a threat to American security. He was a threat to Anglo-American oil interests. And in 1953, those two things were treated as equivalent. The people who made that decision are all dead. The decision itself is not. It is present every day. In the news, in the tensions, in the wars that have grown from the wounds opened in those 3 days. Every time the words Iran and America appear in the same sentence in the context of conflict, somewhere in that sentence, invisibly, is a man in pajamas who wept in Parliament and believed that his country's oil belonged to his country. He was right, and they destroyed him for it. If stories like this matter to you, the ones buried under 60 years of official denial, the ones that explain today by uncovering yesterday, subscribe, because there are many more.